So, um, I don't know whether you guys had any opportunity to think about the question that I left us with last week. Um,
Oh fuck, I completely forgot about that.
yeah, I had a feeling. I probably should have reminded people if I wanted it to actually be a thing. Sort of did it at the last moment, but yeah. Um, I don't know if you'd like. I think we can probably just start today's discussion with that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the question really is: in some way, it may seem like one needs to be discontent in some way to push outside one's comfort
Oh,
zone. Like, why else would you be motivated to do that, right? Why work hard if you're already happy and satisfied with where you're at, right? Is this true? Does one actually need to be unsatisfied in some way in order to be motivated to do work to improve?
Um, I think motivation's only an emotion. We can only do so much. Like, if we're not motivated, I think that if we're looking to get better at something, but we're not always feeling the best about what we're doing, then sometimes we'll just want not do it. There are cases where you can be extremely motivated to do something, but a fear of sort of, like fear can actually stop you from doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that no amount of motivation will overcome a strong fear of failure.
Sure.
And so, like, I think that's a good point of discussion. Is how do we
Well,
find motivation if it's only sort of like a passing emotion that's really only there sometimes, and then the other rest of the time you have to go off of something else.
Well, the idea of motivation, as talked about by Jared Tendler, is the idea that it's the emotion behind your goals, right? So the idea of that it's not there all the time, I think that sounds more like inspiration to me than motivation, right? Inspiration, he talks about as the emotion that occurs when you see something inspiring, right? Like, you watch some kind of like a sports film or something, or in my case, you rewatch Kung Fu Panda for the sixth time, right? Or something along those lines. I apologize for the vacuum in the back. That's going to be pretty amazing. Um,
we can barely hear it.
Good. Okay, it's very loud for me, so I hope it doesn't get any louder for you. The where so it might come from music, it might come from a movie, it might come from any number watching somebody else succeed at a thing, right? Like any other of those sorts of things can all cause inspiration, which is like kind of a short term, very very intense burst of a desire to work and to pursue goals, right? But motivation is more about like the emotion behind the goals in the first place, right? It's like it kind of has to do with like the why of your goals. You know what I mean? It's like there's some kind of a reason that you want to do the thing that you've set as a goal, right? And that reason is your motivation, right? Or it's the source of your motivation, right? So I guess kind of what I'm thinking here is like, if you're going to, if someone has set a goal to do something, right? The only thing that we can say for sure is that they want it to be done, right? They want to reach that point, right? That's something that they want to happen. I think the question is, in order to want something to happen, do you, by definition, have to be unhappy with the current state of affairs in some way, or unsatisfied with it?
I don't know if you have to be unhappy, but you could just think that something. It might be like you might be happy, but you think you could be like happier.
Mm-hmm. So would that not then qualify as you're unhappy with the amount of happiness that you currently have?
I think that in some ways complacency is kind of poisonous for endeavors of skill, but I also,
for the record, I am undecided on this issue. I do not actually have.
Yeah,
playing devil's advocate.
I'm not sure at all either. This is really interesting. So, yeah, if you quantify happiness and like say you could be wanting, or if no, but in the end it's going to look back. If I say if your goal is to be like the happiest you can, like that means you don't think you're happy enough, so that still counts, whatever.
But like that's the thing, right? So, like is like I want to question like is that necessarily true, right? Like is to want to be happier to be unsatisfied with the amount of happiness that you currently have? Is that actually true, or is that just like a sometimes sort of thing, right? Can you both be satisfied and want to improve?
I think so. I mean, that's sort of, you and I have talked about that a lot, where it's like, for somebody who, maybe has ADHD like me, being dissatisfied is only a way for me to, live in shame because I'm so bad at what I do. But rather, it's like, no, it's that I'm pretty good, but I can be better, right? It doesn't mean that I'm dissatisfied with what I'm doing, but like, I can always be doing what I can do better. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like the camp that I'm starting to reside in. That it's like, motivation doesn't have to be about I have to be better, but rather, I can do it, but what are the ways I can do it better?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, like, personally, of course, I definitely, I have a vested interest in wanting to believe that it's possible to be in a state where you are both satisfied with where you are and have motivation to get better. And it's certainly something that I encourage people to try to work towards and all of that. I guess I don't really have the tools to answer this question, I feel like, right? It's like, I don't really have a solid definition of what it means to be unhappy, and it feels kind of like wordplay when I say it out loud, you know what I mean? It's like, is wanting to be better the same as not being happy with where you are now, right? Like, it's I guess it kind of comes down to how you feel, right? And I think it is probably possible to feel okay and want to be better at the same time. I think that it's hard to think with a vacuum going on.
Well, at least from my experience, that if I don't feel decent about where I'm at the moment, then I just feel really bad all around. And that might just be, an ADHD thing specifically. I'm not sure if somebody without ADHD would ever have that sort of same feeling as me, but
I certainly think I've had it. To feel unsatisfied with where you're at, I think, is not uncommon in the slightest. I think almost everyone has experienced that at some point. It's definitely, though, I think something that people with ADHD are probably more prone to.
Yeah.
Because of the physiology.
Yeah.
It's like we feel it sometimes. You're almost guaranteed to feel it and feel it like almost all the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you aren't taking steps to directly address it.
Definitely, that makes sense for sure.
Mm-hmm. Which I think is kind of how I've been starting to think about like ADHD in general. That being that you know, it's not that you're feeling something different than I've felt. It's that you're feeling the same thing, but it's way stronger, and it's not something that you can avoid, and it's not something that ever goes away.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. I think for sure. That's sort of how I'm starting to realize it as well. It's not like because of the brain chemistry. It's just I feel things a lot more intensely.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we feel like this is done, shall we start on Chapter 3, Mental Representations?
It wasn't a very satisfying answer, but it's about as satisfying as we're going to get, I think.
Yeah, right? I mean, like, in the end, I think the thing is we still don't know, really.
It's
right?
a very personal thing, I think.
Mm-hmm. And it's... I mean, that said, you know, I mean, like, the thing that we're asking is, like, is it possible, right? So, all we need to find is one example of someone who feels that way. That proves it's possible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I think, given that you're getting closer and closer to it, that I think that we can say that, yeah, it is possible to achieve that state. And that should probably be something that people try to aim at, right? Okay. So, let's see. So, Chapter 3 opens up with a section on blindfolded chess. Yeah? They talk about Alexander Alekhine and how in 1924 he played 26 opponents without seeing any of the boards, won 16 of the games, lost 5, and took 5 to a draw. And the author mentions this because he finds it kind of interesting that Alekhine never really set out to learn to play blindfolded chess. He just sort of set out to learn to play chess, and as a kind of a weird side effect, sort of stumbled into being able to do blindfolded chess on accident, right? He started playing chess at 7. He got involved in correspondence tournaments, which I imagine is like postal chess, right?
Yeah, that's postal chess.
And that kind of took over his life at like age 10, right? And he started analyzing positions by like writing them down on paper, so that he could take them into class with him and start thinking about them there, right? And over time, he got so good at thinking about the positions that he found that he didn't even need the paper anymore, right? He could just do it entirely in his head, which I imagine was really wonderful for looking intensely focused while not paying attention in the slightest to the lessons that he was in. He played his first blindfold game at the age of 12 after watching another famous exhibition that happened, which he says that his brother was in, but there's no record of that. And by the age of 16, he was doing 4 or 5 simultaneous blindfold games, but ended up kind of moving away from that to focus instead on regular chess. I found it really interesting that he ended up supporting himself primarily by holding public exhibitions, right? He did chess as a way to make money, not necessarily as something that he set out to do. So, I think that this brings up kind of an interesting point about, like, blindfolded chess as it relates to League of Legends, right? I imagine that the best, like, 1v1 player in the world is probably also pretty close to the best overall player in the world. That would be a guess that I would hazard, right? You know? Like, you take Mo, for instance, right, as a player, and he's someone who does, like, 1v1 money matches, like, quite a lot, and very rarely loses them, right? And
And when he does, it's because he made a really huge unforced blunder, and then goes, ah, and puts his hands in his face.
Yeah, and he's like milking it for content, right? Like
Yeah.
he has mastered the art of the stream rage. So, the thing that I'm kind of seeing there, right, is that he didn't really set out to become the best 1v1 player in the universe. He set out to get good at League of Legends, happened to really enjoy Yasuo, spent a ton of time learning Yasuo in specific, and as a result, ended up being fantastic at one-on-ones, right? It seems similar to me, right? You know, like variants of the game share fundamentals, right? And I think it's especially interesting when you think about how League of Legends changes over time, and how I think that implies that learning the fundamentals of the game that are unlikely to change is that much more valuable than everything else, right? You will at some point in your life be asked to play a different meta than the one that is currently being played, right? You'll maybe be asked to learn a different set of champions than the ones that you're currently playing, right? So building solid mental representations of the fundamentals of the game allows you to quickly adapt and respond to changes in the rule set, similar to what you might see with blindfolded chess, right? Like it's chess, but you can't see the chessboard, right? It's League of Legends, but you can't pick Kazakhs anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like League of Legends where they replaced a bishop with some other piece that maybe you can only move 4 now because they had to nerf bishop because it's OP.
Yeah. And there's the Mega King that takes up 4 spaces on the board, and you know,
He can't move it.
can't move it.
You have to attack it from all angles for 4 turns.
Yeah, exactly. You get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You roll a dice to determine whether it takes damage. Anyway, yeah. For reference, this is there's an absolutely wonderful video made by the Canadian comedy troupe Loading Ready Run called "The New Chess," and most of my jokes just now were basically ripped straight out of that video. So, highly recommend it. It's a pretty funny one. Go check it out. So. Yeah, I don't know. Basically agreed, I guess, on that. Like, you know, you set out to become a good League of Legends player. You happen to pick up 1v1 skills. Does that sound correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, what other sorts of things do we feel like transfer learning in League of Legends does and does not apply to? I guess I'll have that as kind of the question. Right? Because, I mean, that's basically kind of part of the debate that we... You feel like there's not much? Really? Okay.
I feel like a lot of the skills that you learn in League can be applied to a lot of different games and a lot of different skills in life. You know, you have to learn how to take what you're given and get what you can out of it. That's a hugely important skill for life. You have to be able to communicate with the people around you effectively. You have to, you know, learn a lot about risk assessment. You have to learn a lot about sort of you know, how to function in a place where nobody's helping you, right? It's kind of like there's a lot of little skills in there that really help you in life, able to, you know, transfer over to other places that people don't really even think about. Not even just like the game skills themselves, but even just the brain skills you have to use.
Now, here's a question for you. I've certainly experienced those same things, right? Those same benefits as a result of learning the game. Do you think that learning the game necessarily implies learning those skills? Or do you think that you happen to learn them as a result of pursuing the skills that were necessary to become good at League of Legends?
I think the only time you learn them is if you're taking the game seriously enough to actually sit down and learn them. There's a lot of players out there who just play the game for fun, and they're not really thinking about what kind of thing they need to do to get better, so they just kind of go with the flow, and they never really learn, you know, sort of
Now, here's kind of my thought.
mental things.
I think that there are pro players that exist today who undoubtedly have learned the game to a very high level that have not learned those lessons.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it that learning those skills helps you to play League of Legends better? Or is it that learning to play League of Legends better actually teaches you those skills?
I'd say it's probably the first one more than the second one, only because you kind of have to be looking for those skills, I think, in some ways. If you can get to a point where you're a top 10 challenger without ever having learned, mental resilience or anything like that, then clearly there's something to be said about the split between the mental game and the tactical game, as far as, learning those communication skills and leadership skills and all that. Like look at Tarzan, for example. He's a player who is remarkably good. He's incredibly good. He can, be top 5, top 10 challenger when he's not being banned for elo boosting.
Yeah, no joke.
But he's also extremely angry and has a quick temper and will hard throw games just because somebody didn't help him at a blue buff in 6 minutes or something like that, right? So it's like, there's something to be said about, that sort of split there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I wonder how much of that is a product of the game is so new and the skills are so badly understood that the people who have them have an insane advantage, but there's so few of them that the ladder isn't saturated with them at the highest levels? Or is it that the skills don't matter as much as we think they do? Obviously, I think my leaning is the first, right? I think that it's a matter of that the game is so new that even pro players have a ton to learn. You know what I mean? I wouldn't describe them as masters of the game, really.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm open to dissent on this.
I agree completely. I think that a lot of it is going to have mostly to do with the fact that these players haven't really. So here's the thing, right? If nobody has mental game in the top 100 in the ladder, then you can get to the top 100 of the ladder without the mental game, right? But if all of a sudden 99 people have the mental game and the same tactical skill, then all of a sudden you don't have mental game, you're stuck at top 100 at the most, right? And even players who are tactically worse than you may be better than you because they just never tilt or they always stay clear-headed. So I think that in the current world climate, it's not that players. I think it's that they haven't learned yet.
Mm-hmm.
None of them, basically, except for maybe top 5. Maybe we're up to top 5 now who have mental game, help, because sports psychologists are on every team, but not very many sports psychologists are very good at navigating those waters yet.
Mm-hmm. It's a relatively new field,
right? Because I think that, the ones that I'm seeing the most success with are Jared Tendler's, and then the one, I don't know his name, but there's a sports psychologist who works on G2 that's been really successful too. They're the only two that I really have seen that have made tremendous work out of their rosters, right? Because they go from being pretty mediocre, grabbing a few players, doing pretty good, and then just hard stomping the region for the next year. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't disagree that I've noticed that too, right? The teams that get sports psychologists immediately rise to the top of the ranks. So my guess is that it's actually pretty important.
You can even see this in some of the Team Liquid's old comms with Dardoch on them.
Sure.
He was kind of a tilter that would basically induce secondhand tilt to other people because he would just tilt so hard.
For sure.
And then you could kind of see it in the mic checks and stuff. That it was really not fun to play with him. And they drop him, they grab Jared Tendler, and within a year now they're just getting first place in every split.
Yep. Despite Doublelift and his somewhat questionable things that he says when he's playing solo queue, I've noticed.
No. Oh, tilty things?
Oh yeah, no, it's pretty funny to me actually. Like he I felt like used to be pretty good in his mental game, but like I don't know. I've recently seen him get like quite a bit of injustice still actually while playing solo queue, and it's funny to me. Suffering
That
from
is funny.
success.
Figure that he's winning NA, so
Well,
Yeah, that
I
makes
think
sense.
it started when they placed like second at MSI. You know, I feel like he got close enough that like I don't know. I don't think he feels satisfied, but he feels more satisfied than he has in years. You know what I mean?
yeah.
And I think that
Definitely.
he is. I suspect that he's getting a little complacent, but obviously I don't see him in the training room. I don't see him
So
in
so
a
what
lot
you
of
mean
other
is that
situations.
CLG is gonna win the LCS?
That entirely could be true. I actually haven't been following anything about what's been going on, so I couldn't tell you. But yeah, probably. That sounds right. The CLG come from behind victory. 06 to 7-6 to be okay.
Well, as soon as you start getting excited,
Yeah.
for
That does indeed tend to be the meme, does it not?
Yep.
So let's see.
why? Oh my god! Oh my fucking god! Jesus Christ! Oh my word! People that AFK at the start of the game gauge
Yikes.
my ass.
So the next kind of bit of the chapter talked about a chess decision making study done by Herb Simon and Bill Chase. And I think this is kind of getting into the stuff that's really interesting in this chapter, right? Given just a couple of seconds, masters were able to recreate almost the whole board after having seen like a chess position once, and were able to reproduce the most important areas perfectly, whereas novices were only able to recreate a few sections of a few pieces of the board and had absolutely no idea where the rest of the pieces were. Right. This was a study done in the early 70s with high-level, mid-level, and novice-level chess players. And they did kind of two sections, right? One was boards arranged with real positions from actual games that got played, and one arranged with totally random positions that would never arise in real play. With positions that were realistic, masters were able to remember about 2/3 of the board after 5 seconds. Novices only able to remember about 4 pieces, and mid-levels somewhere in between, right? Essentially, as you get better at the game, you're able to remember more of what's going on after a short period of just looking at it. With fake positions, just constructed by randomly arranging pieces on the board in a way that would never arise in real play, essentially all 3 groups, novices, mid-levels, and masters, were unable to remember more than like 2 or 3 pieces. So more recent studies verified the findings. The essential takeaway is that the memory skills involved in chess are very specialized, right? They only really work when you're dealing with the sorts of patterns that you've already seen quite a bit, right? It's like a pattern recognition thing. It no longer works when you're seeing totally random patterns, even if the pieces are the same. they also kind of came up with the idea of thinking about patterns that are stored in long-term memory that are then recognized kind of as cohesive units or chunks, right? And these chunks, these patterns that can be recognized and kind of used as shorthand for a whole set of implications about a game state, are what allow masters to do what they do so quickly and so thoroughly with such little time, right? They're not actually fully analyzing every position that they look at from scratch. They're using what they've seen before to shorthand a ton of the analysis and go straight to the conclusion without going through each step one by one.
Mm-hmm.
So
you tend to, from my experience in chess, you tend to just sort of like the candidate moves, the checks, the force moves, like the takes, or the switches, the whatever, the tactical moves seem to kind of pop out automatically. Then you kind of have to like look at like, hey, how can they respond if I do each of these things? And then you kind of figure out like, hey, which one gets me the most over the next, however many turns.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
And you can't really, the only reason I'm able to do that now is because I've built up more pattern recognition. Before that, it's kind of like, I would just do whatever, right? That doesn't work.
Yeah. So I'd like to have a conversation about like what kinds of patterns are there in League of Legends, and what are some of the lower level patterns and what are some of the higher level patterns.
Okay, well, first define lower level versus higher level pattern, I think.
So when I talk about lower level patterns, I'm talking about patterns that have to do with essentially the game pieces, right? And when we think about the game pieces and literal moves that can be made, we're kind of talking about like inputs, you know what I mean? Things such as, let's see, right, like perhaps your pattern that you recognized of a more efficient way to do auto attack harass, right, where you recognize that the pattern of clicking on them before they get into range, so that your auto is buffered and goes off as immediately as is possible, rather than clicking on them only once they have gotten into range.
Mm-hmm.
That was like a pattern that you recognized that was fairly low level, right? Of
fairly consistent across the board, yeah.
Yeah, and fairly consistent across the board. Whereas like a higher level pattern might be something like, I'll give an example of a pattern that I've recognized, that being shove, establish vision, force a face check, win a team fight, take an objective, base, spend gold, push, end the game. And I've noticed that this is a pattern that repeats in high-level map movements for strong teams in roughly that sequence in almost every game that gets played, right? And so, this is, each of those steps that I mentioned is made up of tons and tons and tons of smaller decisions, you know what I mean? How does one actually effectively shove? How does one effectively establish vision? What does it mean to have vision, right? Immediately you can recognize that each of these steps is its own chunk with several sub-chunks and, kind of going all the way down to the level of, like, I press the 4 key on my keyboard to place a ward in this particular push. You know what I mean?
The issue with this analogy is that chess is a game of perfect information.
Well, I don't know if it's
is that
really.
Can I please make my point?
Sure.
Since it's a game of perfect information, the patterns we get every time you take a look at the board, you see everything literally, right?
Sure.
But in League, it's like the patterns you see are like the fact seeing patterns is seeing all the information is a skill in itself, whereas in chess it's like all the information is right in front of you. It's about if you can make the right decisions with the information. So there's definitely something about this.
And you think that makes it
harder.
Harder.
Indeed. Yeah.
Certainly, I can agree with harder. I don't know that I necessarily agree with impossible.
Yeah, no, definitely possible.
It's just that the information is going to be somewhat the patterns are going to have to be somewhat probabilistic, right? And once you add probabilistic thinking to a mental model, it immediately becomes that much more difficult. I mean, just like go read Daniel Kahneman, right? Like, it's like so easy to make intuitive errors when you're dealing with probabilities and statistics and things like that. But certainly, I think, even if you don't have perfect information, right? Seeing patterns in the information that you do have is what chunks are about, right? So,
and also in a game like League, there's, even with not knowing where the jungler is, there's very repeatable pathways that each jungler can go based on the kit, based on game state. That kind of tells you that once you have enough information, it doesn't really matter exactly where they are, because you kind of have a general idea of where they're going to be 90+% of the time.
Yeah, and they can choose to deviate from that, but if they do so, they're doing it at the cost of numerical efficiency, right? And so, it turns into some game theory shit, right? Where you gotta like balance what you do, how much of the time, and you do like a mixed strategy of things to keep people on their toes and force them to play around what you don't end up doing, right? And that's kind of where incomplete information really starts to make the game space really blow up in terms of its complexity. But even to be able to say, right, based on what the jungler is, based on the fact that there are only a certain number of camps that they can clear to get, to a point where they're strong enough where they can be a threat to me, and based on that there are a set number of routes that can be done efficiently by this jungler, and by efficiently I mean, that such that they exit with high enough level, high enough HP, high enough mana to successfully come fight me. This space that, as a complete novice, would seem completely impossible to even consider. The jungler could be literally anywhere. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of their thinking, right? Like, but we find out that that's not actually true, right? The jungler can't be literally anywhere just because they're in Fog of War. There are only a couple of places that they can be. And the reason that we know that is because we've chunked a lot of the information about jungle pathing, about the specific champion's kits, about the jungle itself, in order to allow us to make those kinds of statements.
Right. So the way I would take that analogy to chess is if you took any 4 squares of the chessboard and obscured the pieces in there, you wouldn't know what pieces are in there, but you would know what pieces aren't in there, and you would know that if there's a piece in that general area, you know which set of squares is threatened, depending on which square you think that piece is in. But it's not going to be all those squares are threatened, so it's not like you're going to have no idea of what's going on there. You're going to have a pretty good idea of what is going on there.
Can you imagine playing chess with Fog of War, where the only squares of the opponent that you can see are the squares that your piece is actively threatening?
Yeah, that would be a very difficult game.
You're not kidding. It'd be hilarious.
And they're like, yeah, your pawn line effectively becomes your vision line. Jesus Christ!
Right?
You pretty much just like have to keep all your pawns, or you just lose.
Yeah, it'd be pretty interesting. So, either way, I guess I don't really know what to ask or what to think about this. I mean, like, it seems important, but like I don't know that I necessarily think there are a lot of things that I was able to see that were like surprising in this particular chapter.
No, I mean it makes sense. It's that the thing most people find surprising is that you don't just build up chess knowledge by being born a chess god. But we kind of already all knew that, right?
Yeah, certainly we all knew.
A lot of people going into that book are going in thinking, hey, I'm just not good at this thing because I don't have the talent for it.
Mhm.
And then they read that study that shows, oh, this guy who spent 10,000 hours practicing chess is better than this guy who spent 4,000 hours practicing, and that's been replicated across the board. Maybe there's something to the idea that it's not just about what you're born with.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. And it seems like, although I think that the chunking as a mental model for how mental models get formed, right? I think it's like really interesting and really good. I don't know if I see any immediate implications for how someone should approach training in League of Legends. Can you think of any?
Laning, specifically.
Okay.
The way I've chunked laning is into a set of 4 different working wave states as well as the matchup. So it's like, hey, if my lane is slow pushing, then I can do this thing, and this thing easier. My lane is shoving into me, then I can do this thing and this thing and this thing easier. If my lane is past half point, I have to watch out for the jungler. If the other jungler is strong and we don't have control over our jungler, I have to watch out for dives. Just like those little 6 things kind of like determine, combined with the 2v2 matchup, which is based
its
on
own set of chunks.
Damage, right? Yeah, damage, range, wave clear, and CC that determine how I want to manage the wave. But regardless of how I manage the wave, the set of circumstances of I can look for harass here, I can look for harass there, I can look for trades, I can do this, will stay the same because it's dependent on the wave state and where the wave is, more than it is the matchup. The matchup certainly play a big part in it too, but the wave itself is probably, I think, the biggest factor of that sort of chunking that I've done.
So, in terms of how you came to chunk it that way, I guess, what did you end up doing? I remember you saying that you had done a good amount of reading or watching of like Skill Capped, right? And that was kind of where you got the idea?
Yeah, so Skill Capped, they have a lot of these videos where they go over the matchups, like they have the 4 little factors, and then they tell you this guy does more damage, this guy's more range, so you should deal with the wave this way, and this way. And what I'm finding is that wave management is a factor of how much you want to, how strong you are, essentially. The stronger you are, the harder you can push and still be okay. And the weaker you are, the more you want to stay on your side and be safe. So like if you have losing damage and losing range, you let them slow push, you try not to let them push you in, and then you just look for the best trade you possibly can. If you're really strong, you look to slow push, bounce the turret, and then harass them as often as you can under turret, and also if you're safe from the jungler, and also while they're trying to farm, and then you bounce it, and then you zone them off the way, stuff like that. There's like only 3 or 4 really big decisions about wave management you can actually make that are influenced basically by how much stronger or weaker than you are than them in bot lane.
Okay. So one thing that kind of I'm reminded of is the idea of critical factors, right, for a given decision. And I think it's like if you're trying to to continue on with like what do mental models like do for you, right? They tend to make you better at planning because they allow you to foresee potential future problems and work through them in advance of them actually coming up. And they enable you to learn because they allow you to give yourself feedback. Essentially, your mental models allow you to construct metrics for seeing whether or not you're actually doing what you need to do, right? And so if you're trying to build a mental model of something so that you can do it faster, better, with fewer errors, that kind of thing, typically what you will want to do, I think, is figure out what factors you should pay attention to while making that particular decision. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And that's like at once obvious and very not obvious. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, the process of figuring out what factors are at play is a matter of pattern recognition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that pattern recognition is chunking, right? It's figuring out, what in the hell matters to this. You know what I mean? And
right.
It's like if you're a jungler, right? And you have no idea how to gank, right? Like you're just starting out on the role, and you really just like that you're supposed to gank, but you just don't really know how to do it, when to do it, how to decide when to do it, all of that kind of different stuff, right? My advice tends to be just gank always. Just do nothing but gank, right? Like gank, farm a level, gank again, farm another level, gank again, and just like don't worry about anything other than that. And what that will do is it will give you a bunch of data to start sorting through and start trying to see patterns in, right? Even if the very first thing that you just look at is just like a simple pass-fail, you might have a metric of like, did I kill him or not, right? And you look at all of the ganks that you successfully killed them, you look at all of the ganks that you didn't successfully kill them, and you try and see what's common between the ganks that succeed and what's common between the ganks that fail, right? If you can start to do that pattern recognition, that's going to help you identify what the factors are that you need to pay attention to when deciding when to gank, right? And that's what then allows you to make a mental model. You start saying like, oh, when the enemy is pushing in and they're like far away from their turret, the gank succeeds more, right? And when their flash is up, it's a lot harder because they can get back to their turret more quickly, right? You just have these like really, really simple observations of like what actually happens when you try to kill someone in a ganking scenario, right? And then these allow you to start saying, well, I should probably track whether their flash is up or down, and I should pay attention to the position of the person that I'm trying to gank and see how far away they are from their turret and how much space I'll have to actually run them down the lane, right? And these sorts of realizations lead you to create the mental models that then allow you to succeed more and fail less, right? And it's like, yeah, dead simple, but like, I don't know, let's take a decision that one of you are struggling with and start like trying to do this kind of stuff, right? So do either of you have anything off the top of your head that you've been sort of struggling with lately in terms of figuring out how to succeed at it?
Well, for me specifically, I guess it'd be trade timings.
Okay.
Not like losing a buttload of CS or like losing a buttload of health because I walked up.
So it's essentially the decision of like trade or don't trade, right?
Yeah.
So given this, right, the idea would be to trade a lot and start seeing what the sort of common patterns are in terms of what tends to work and what tends to not work.
Mm-hmm.
So what kinds of patterns have you noticed while thinking about trade timings so far?
Well, the first thing I've noticed is that isolation is probably the biggest thing. It's like If you and your support are lined up properly and theirs and their support are not, then you can pretty much always go for a trade even if you're in a losing AD carry support matchup. But if they're lined up and you're not, then you can pretty much never go for a minion because they can both hit you and you can't retaliate because you're just going to lose half your health. So like that's the first thing I determine. And then it's like if both people are lined up, then the matchup comes into play. Then it's more about who wins the 2v2, right? Because it's like
but if both people are not actually present to put the 2 in 2v2, then it's 2v1, right, and that's insane. Reason.
Yeah. So it's like if I'm Twitch Bard versus like Ezreal Soraka or something like that. Like maybe I'm Draven Bard versus Twitch Soraka or something. It's like as the Twitch and Soraka, if the Bard is off doing whatever its own thing, I can trade with the Draven because I can heal up, I can do whatever. But if Draven and Bard are lined up properly, then I can't even think about approaching the wave, even if we are lined up properly, because if I get hit by Bard auto Q plus a Draven axe auto, I already lost half my health.
Yeah, no kidding.
So,
So kind of numbers advantage immediately
right.
sort of pops out as a factor that should be considered.
Yeah, so like it'd be like 1 is numbers advantage, 2 would be like cooldowns, or like range, and then the third factor would be something like crowd control, and then the fourth factor would be something like wave clear, and that's like sort of like the order I think through, like in terms of like yeah, sure, Caitlyn Karma can wave clear faster than me, but that's a lot less important than how much damage Caitlyn's Karma can do to me if I try to go for a minion while they're both able to Karma Q, R, or whatever, and then Caitlyn auto Q, E, whatever,
Sure. Makes sense. So, what are, in recent memory, some of the matchups or situations that you felt like you took bad trades in, and what patterns have you noticed in those trades?
It would always be Caitlyn's, pretty much always. The support wouldn't matter as much, but generally it would be that I would be standing pretty far back behind my minions, and then without really even doing anything, I would just be sitting there waiting for the next minion to get low, and almost without fail, Caitlyn's would just see me kind of close to my minion wave and then walk up past their melee line just to hit me once or twice. It's like they don't pay attention to, whether I'm actually going to hit the minion. They just, like, randomly walk up and do it. Like, okay. And I found that in a lot of cases, I still had pretty high health minions, so I didn't have to last hit anything. So, like, what I would end up doing is pretending that I'm going to walk up and auto a minion, and then I would, like, throw my W down and then, like, auto them, like, 3 times as they try to walk away, autoing me, and then win with my E, right? So it's like, I'm noticing that even in matchups where I have range disadvantage, like against Caitlyn, I can, in a lot of cases, if they're walking past their melee line, I can just force a trade on them because of the minions. Whereas before, it'd just be like, oh, Caitlyn's on me, I have to walk away now. Even though I wasn't considering, like, the line of minions as being a line of territory control. So, like, if I'm trading with somebody in a losing matchup, I never go past my melee line anymore. I just, like, if I'm trying to trade with them, I will cut it off right at the melee line every single time now.
So it seems like that kind of puts into mind a second really important kind of fundamental principle of the game, that being defender's advantage, right? Your turrets and your minions protect you, right? And so even if you're, maybe you're isolated, right? Or maybe isolation takes priority, right? But, assuming that isolation doesn't come into play and that it is a 2v2, them walking forward and trading inside of your wave is a very, very different scenario than you walking forward and trading inside of their wave, right? And so defender's advantage maybe helped you win some trades that you were losing before, that you didn't think you could take because the 2v2 sort of implied that maybe it wasn't going to happen.
Right, exactly. And that's sort of like what I'm learning a lot is that like matchups only mean so much, really, because like no amount of matchups gonna save you if you're taking a minion and a half, minion wave and a half of damage.
Yeah, you're not kidding. And this, I think, too, kind of comes down to, who can and can't decide to extend a trade. It all kind of comes down to if both of you in this position just sit there and hit each other, who dies first. You know what I mean? Like, the reason that Caitlyn has to back away, and the reason that you're able to trade on her without taking a whole bunch of return autos, is because if she sits there and return autos, she literally dies before you do.
Yeah.
Right? And so everything in trading kind of comes down to dealing damage to them from a position where if they sit there and deal damage back to you, they'll die first.
Mm-hmm. And that's been a pretty big realization. And it's not like it's because it's like I always knew that, but at the same time it was sort of like hard to see when you're actually in the moment.
Yeah,
you know?
Knowing and feeling it are not the same, as we're so fond of saying.
And it's just like for those sorts of patterns, you have a really hard time actually pulling those patterns into your internal memory unless you have somebody who's actually sitting there with the video, like lecturing or whatever, like showing you several cases in which that happens, and then you start to see it when you're playing your own games.
Indeed.
But before then, it's like it's really hard to actually sit there and see them because it's not like you've ever really looked for them.
Uh-huh. And speaking to that point, there was a bit in the chapter that I'm going to read a quote that I thought was really interesting in terms of how to become a chess grandmaster. Right? The authors say, anyone who is serious about developing skills on the chessboard will do it mainly by spending countless hours studying games played by the masters. You analyze a position in depth, predicting the next move, and if you get it wrong, you go back and figure out what it was that you missed. Research has shown that the amount of time spent in this sort of analysis, not the amount of time spent playing chess with others, is the single most important predictor of a chess player's ability. It generally takes almost 10 years of this sort of practice to reach the level of Grandmaster. So, the question that I wanted to pose is, there was actually a recent pair of infographics that were published by Mobalytics that show the schedules and practice routines of Griffin Tarzan and SKT Khan. And notably, during the periods of practice that they spend outside of the game, not during their play, both of them are spending roughly 80% of their time studying their own replays and watching VODs of other players. My question is, do we think that this might actually be kind of a low number? Do we think that there is value in saying that players should spend more time reviewing and less time playing? Or do we think that the pro schedule that people are on right now is probably better? And if we think that it's better, why do we think it's better? What are the relevant differences between chess and League of Legends that cause playing more to be more worthwhile as opposed to reviewing more and potentially doing decision-making exercises and these sorts of things? And furthermore, does it have to do with that they're already pro players, and would it be different for someone who is trying to go pro versus someone who's already at that level?
Sort of the time you need to spend is going to vary, right? Because like if you're somebody who's like a 1500 level chess player, which is kind of like an opening tournament level player, somebody's pretty decent. They're going to need to spend a lot more time studying outside of the game than somebody who's already an international master who is very, very good at most concepts, except for maybe, abstract end games or something like that, where like, oh, I don't know what to do when I have a king and a pawn and they have a king, rook, and whatever, right? So it's like, and certainly grandmasters spend a buttload of time studying, but they study very obscure chess positions that require several hundred hours of analysis to really find like what gives you a slight advantage through several different variations of chess lines. So it's like, on one hand, one should spend a lot of time studying and learning things from other players, but on the other hand, there's no substitute for experience. In my opinion, I would like to see something like 50 to 60% studying on the game, and then like lowering it as you get better and better to the point where like maybe you don't need to spend half your time studying, maybe you only need to spend a quarter of your time studying or an eighth of your time studying, but you should still always be looking to learn new things while also looking to refine what you have in practice and in games.
Indeed. So when we take a look at Tarzan, what we see is he's got 2 scrim blocks that are just about 3 hours long, and he's got a big block of 4 hours that's solo queue / practice, right? And when we look at what it says about his practice, right, he says that roughly 75% of his game time is spent in scrims, and roughly 25% of it is spent in solo queue. So if we're seeing roughly 6 hours of scrims and 4 hours of solo queue or practice, that seems like it works out to about half of the time that he's doing solo queue / practice, he's doing solo queue, right? So like 2 hours of solo queue, 6 hours of scrims, for a total of 8 hours of playtime, and then an extra 2 hours, one of which is watching one of his replays, and the rest of which is watching a different VOD, using stat sites, and checking other regional metas.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at Khan, we see something a little bit different. He also has 6 hours of scrims, two sets of 3-hour games. But then he's got 3 hours kind of scattered throughout the day of practice outside the game, and 3 hours set aside specifically for solo queue, unrelated to practice outside the game. This leaves him with a 2/3, 1/3 ratio of scrims to solo queue, so he tends to play more solo queue than Tarzan does. And in his practice outside of the game during those 3 hours that he sets aside to do that, so notably he spends like an even split between solo queue and outside and the rest of the stuff that he does for practice, as opposed to Tarzan, who doesn't, right? And for Khan, he spends about 40% of his time watching his own replays, 40% watching VODs, and 20% using stat sites.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think that lines up to is, if he's got 3 hours going on, 40% of 3 hours is a little over an hour. Isn't that about right?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah. So probably 1 hour of watching his own replay, 1 hour of watching a VOD, and then a little bit of leftover time to use stat sites or do something else. So he's also only kind of getting maybe 2 hours worth of watching replays and watching VODs. So I thought that was kind of interesting, actually.
Well, what's the conclusion you draw?
I guess the conclusion that I draw is I actually have I have a supposition that review will probably be... I think it's more important than either of these players recognize. I have a supposition that the amount of actual playtime is generally higher than it needs to be right now, and that the amount of review time is generally lower than it needs to be. And the reason that I think this is because of the way that mental models are formed, right? First, you have to collect a whole bunch of data, right? You have to go out and play and come up with some stuff, or you have to watch a whole ton of odds, right? Then you have to spend time reviewing those VODs and analyzing the positions in order to come up with modifications to your gameplay that you actually want to make, right? So if you're not spending very much time watching your own replays or watching VODs, then I find it unlikely that you will find very many things that you want to be doing differently, right? Unless these schedules are simplified and they don't include reviews done as a team, right? Like maybe that's part of scrims, right? And if it is, then, that's probably fine then, right? But my guess is that it isn't. My guess is that it's just like play the games. You know what I mean? So it seems to me like becoming more aware of spending more time trying to find things to wiggle and things to change, and less time actually implementing those changes seems like it would probably yield higher returns to me, just based on my own study and experiences with playing.
I would tend to agree with you, especially when it comes to my ideas of improvement through chess, and because it's sort of what I'm learning here. That most of my improvement in the last few weeks have come from not even playing it; they've come from me watching these videos and really taking notes and thinking about what does it mean to push the wave in this situation because of the matchup, and building those mental models better. Whereas I think if I just keep playing, then it's oh, I'm just gonna lose, and then I don't watch the game, I never figure out why I lose, I don't learn anything, right? Yeah. It's been true of me in chess too, where if I'm just playing a lot of chess, then I don't learn anything. But if I'm playing these games of chess and then going back and analyzing each move and trying to think okay, but why do I do this versus this, and how did I miss this knight take here when I instead took it with the bishop and lost my queen or something like that? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then I realized, okay, in this situation, it's actually better for me to take with my knight, even if it's less intuitive, because then it leaves this square still protected, and then I can still threaten their queen 2 turns from now, rather than lose half my board or whatever, right? So it's things that aren't going to be immediately seeable become seeable because you're sitting there and looking at things like that. And on that note, I do have to use the restroom, so I'll be back in 3 minutes.
Sure.
Be right back.
I guess the thing that's kind of interesting to me is clearly League has a lot more of a lot more of an emphasis on being able to quickly make decisions as opposed to accurately make decisions, right? And perhaps this is what accounts for the increased amount of time spent scrimming and the reduced amount of time spent reviewing, is because perhaps changes are more difficult to implement. You actually have to get them to unconscious competence rather than conscious competence because it's a real-time game, right? That would be the only argument that I could see for doing that much scrimming and that little reviewing, right? Is maybe and two, maybe players are maybe they're strong enough at their mental models that they're able to actually self-review during the games, right? You see a lot of that happening in high elo streams, right? People will use Replay HUD and things like that to go back and watch the same play over again and try to identify corrections and things in the moment, as opposed to playing 100% to perform, right? So, I don't know. What's your take, Dilge? You're very quiet. Even in here? Oh my god, he's literally not even in here.
All right, let's see. I'm back.
Yo.
So, and the other thing is, when it comes to reviews, a lot of people will fall into is they will say what they did wrong, and then just end the analysis with, "I'll just not do that thing anymore." Right?
Yeah, you're not kidding.
This was a problem that I used to have a lot too, where I'd be like, I would go into a replay and be like, obviously I made this mistake, I just won't make that mistake. Easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be able to look at your mistake, figure out why you made the mistake, figure out, the series of events, and then figure out what are the things I can do to either make the mistake not happen or turn the situation around. What are the factors behind all that stuff? And that's hard to do. That's really hard to do for a lot of people who don't have that intuitive understanding of, what's a good play and what's not a good play. Or even, they'll make a really good play that's wrong. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. You won that 2v2, but you were behind their minions, but, they had all their cooldown, they just missed them all. You didn't know where the jungler was, he just didn't come. You had no vision. Your support was standing behind you. All these things went wrong, and somehow you won 2v2. That doesn't make it a good play. It just,
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people will be like, oh, I won this 2v2. That means I should go for this 2v2 because I won it. And then the next time they're out of that situation, they go for it. What happened? They lose, right? And then they're like, busted ass champion, by the way. And then they just keep doing it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so that's a real big problem.
Yeah, the feedback that you get for making a bad decision in League of Legends is very unclear. Sometimes it will still work out, and so you have to be a lot better at coming up with theoretical models than in a lot of other games where you can use results a lot more directly to be a metric for whether or not something was a good play or not. Something I said while you were in the bathroom, I thought Dilge was still in the call, but he's not, was that the only thing that I can think of that makes me think that the increased scrim time could make sense is that League of Legends is a lot more... it's a real-time game, right? And that's an enormous difference, right? So practicing a skill up to the point where it is fully unconscious competence is almost necessary in order for it to show up in real play. You know what I mean? It's like, if it's conscious competence, unless it's a high-level skill involving, a chunk of inputs over time that you can kind of see coming beforehand, you just need to be able to make the decision very quickly, right? And so the extra practice might relate to that. In order to truly implement a change, one has to get good enough to be able to do it in actual real-time high-pressure situations. And so maybe the implementation of the change is more difficult, and you can already find plenty of things to work on just by playing. I don't know. It's a thought.
So, the big thing is that, even in pro sports like football and baseball, very little time is actually devoted to scrimming. A lot of it's going to be, drilling and sort of drilling specific situations we have to be able to make this play happen. Mm-hmm. And most of the time we do this, the enemy team tend to do this, this, and this. And so they have enough people on their squad, they'll have 2 sets of teams.
For sure.
And then and this was what I was kind of talking yesterday in Coach Chat about, where it's like you can't just scrim. Scrimming is useful, but you also have to be able to sit there and practice the specific situations your team struggles in to get those reps in.
I'm doing a book club right now.
I'm telling you, dinner in a half an hour.
Okay.
Or no?
Sure.
You want a little more time or what?
It should be fine.
Okay.
So yeah, I guess with the current difficulty of creating effective drills and with real practice being kind of the only, real like 5v5 practice being the only way to reasonably practice a lot of skills. I tend to agree with what Cyclone was saying and think that there's like a lot more that can be done than is currently being done. But I still think there are a ton of things that really are practiced, if not best, plenty well enough just by playing, that as long as you're kind of going into a match with a will to focus on a specific aspect of your game, you can make decent progress, right? But certainly I agree. I think that probably more drilling than is currently happening should be happening, and more reviewing than is currently happening should be happening. I think there's probably too much playing. Maybe one scrim set a day, and then take the second scrim set and turn that into more of like a specialized practice block, where you're doing things that are more like drills, less close to real games played to win, and more deliberate, basically. I think would probably end up causing the skill of the players to grow faster. So to throw up another quote, the authors say, a mental representation is a mental structure that corresponds to an object, an idea, a collection of information, or anything else, concrete or abstract, that the brain is thinking about. I don't necessarily think there are any implications of this other than that it's like a really nice, important definition, right? And it's kind of useful to have in our back pocket. Any thoughts on that before we move on?
Not really. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think I'm pretty good with that.
Yeah. A much more interesting quote, I think, is one that follows closely after, which says, even when the skill being practiced is primarily physical, a major factor is the development of proper mental representations. Consider a competitive diver working on a new dive. Much of the practice is devoted to forming a clear mental picture of what the dive should look like at every moment, and more importantly, what it should feel like in terms of body positioning and momentum. Emphasis mine. The key thing there, I think, is the word feel, right? You have mentioned quite a bit in terms of learning mechanics and things like that really the feel of it is what you have to get down, right? Not necessarily the sight of it or the idea of it or anything like that, right? And so I think that's a kind of important tip for someone who's maybe a little newer to the game and is kind of struggling with character control and mechanics and things like that, right? If you want to get better at comboing on a champion, don't necessarily focus on what it looks like, focus on what it feels like to do it. Focus on the timing of the button presses and what that timing feels like to execute properly versus improperly. And that emphasis on feel is what really allows you to dive deep into getting finer control over your fingers and your hand and your wrist and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Anything to add on that before we move on?
So, mental representation is very important. It's sort of like, like if you're looking at a chessboard but you don't know what to make of it because you don't have a rule of what the queen, pawns, or whatever. You're just moving all pieces randomly. You're not playing chess at that point, right? You're just playing something completely different, So it's like you have to have some level of mental representation, and then you also want to be able to organize it in such a way that it makes sense, right? So it's like, sure, like you can know the rules of all the pieces, but if you don't know like how those pieces interact with each other, like say having two rooks on the same sort of file means that means you can double protect it, and if they want to take your rook, they also have to sacrifice the piece they take it with. And you're sort of like
Sure.
take piece interactions like that comes from that, then it's like you won't be able to get to a much higher level of just being a beginner. You have to be able to take all the rules and then ascertain what are good things we can do within those rules, then create patterns out of them.
Mm-hmm. Sounds right to me.
And I think that's going to be probably the most important thing in League 2, because it's like, yeah, sure, hit minions is a good rule, but like, as you can see, the simple rule hit minion doesn't always, imply everything that you have to do, because it's not just about hitting minions, it's also hitting minions when you can, hitting minions when you won't lose health, hitting minions when you need to push to be safe, hitting minions certainly, and sometimes you don't hit minions because you don't want it to be further away from you, right? So it's like, hitting minions isn't really enough of a mental representation.
Yeah, the deeper you make a mental representation, the more value you're going to get out of it.
Exactly.
Speaking of depth,
And
you got something?
the way to build mental representation is going to be from watching higher level players play, from reviewing your own games, figuring out, based on what they do and what you do that are different, asking higher level players, getting teachers to help you. Getting teachers to help you is probably going to be the best way to do that, just because it's faster. In League of Legends, a lot of people will be like, coaching? That's funny. Or just get like some platinum guy coaches, which is fine. Nothing against that. Like, I'm a platinum player and I like coaching people. But,
Sure.
You have to be able to find someone who can teach and knows the game at a microscopic level. Kind of like how you wouldn't ever probably become a grandmaster in chess if you were getting taught by, like a high level tournament player, as opposed to an actual grandmaster.
Sure.
Granted, chess is a little bit different because it's much easier to do what you know in a game that you have higher amounts of time to make your turns versus League, but still.
Mm-hmm.
You can be platinum and understand the game at a micro level, but not be able to do it. But that's fairly rare, I would say, actually.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely think that it's tremendously rare. I think if I were to advocate for something, I would say that generally, like the peak rank of a coach is probably going to end up mattering a lot more than the current rank of a coach, right? To within a couple of years, right? If someone has recently, and by recently I mean within like the past 2 years, been challenger, but now they're sitting in low diamond or platinum or something, it's probably okay. They probably still understand the micro of the game well enough to be able to give you something really valuable, right?
Right.
But if self call out, the last time that they were above D5 was in like 2012, then they'll probably have a harder time giving you up-to-date information and a harder time showing you what they mean rather than just telling you what they mean.
right? Or someone like me who, has some knowledge of micro gameplay to a decent level, but then really struggles with being able to apply it. Like, sure, maybe I could teach somebody the theory, but I would never be able to teach somebody how to practice it, make it part of your gameplay.
And you might also struggle to give them appropriate corrective feedback after having watched their stuff, because if you yourself can't identify it and fix it in your own gameplay, then it's not super likely that you'll be able to identify and correct it in their gameplay, assuming that you're actively working on your gameplay at all. Right?
That said, people make the assumption that if you aren't a challenger or something, you just can't be a teacher, which is absolutely false, right? Because you with the platinum gameplay level of knowledge, you can likely take someone from silver to platinum, right? That's not something that's out of the question.
Yeah.
Right?
You'll just struggle to put them. It's difficult to coach someone to be better than what you yourself have been.
Exactly.
That takes a certain level of understanding beyond what you can do, and that is rare. You don't find that very often.
Especially in something as new as League, where it's like, it's like 10 years old, and even the people who are coaching it aren't really the best at knowing how to explain their stuff anyway.
For sure.
You have like your LSs who will know the game really well, but like really aren't the best at explaining it in a way that allows the student to take big steps in progress. He kind of, if you watch his coaching, he kind of goes through a lot of jargon and kind of doesn't explain it very well. And so like the students kind of left saying, yeah, that makes sense, but don't really actually understand it. He has improved a lot in this regard with his mentor representation of coaching, but it is, it's a big problem in the League community where somebody will just throw their knowledge at you and then sound really smart about it, but not really actually help you with your own digestion of it. They're kind of just like, here's what I know, now go do it.
Yeah. You get a lot of people doing knowledge telling, as they said in the chapter. Just kind of very simply kind of just stream of consciousing what they know about the topic, rather than presenting it in any kind of an organized way that allows you to easily create the mental model that you need to do. They just kind of throw the data at you, and it's up to you to create the mental model yourself.
Which is the opposite approach I took with Obsession's significant other, where I started the lesson asking them sort of like what they know about AD carry bot lane, and then I was like, okay, this is what you know, that's cool. Here's a couple of frameworks. Here's the wave management framework, and here's the matchup framework. And then I went through and I was like, okay, now using these frameworks, I want you to tell me why or what you should do in this situation and why. And then as they made their assumptions and told me the reasoning, I would say, okay, that's part of it, but then let's look at a different reason and then ask them that and then sort of draw the knowledge out of them and then slowly correct as it comes up. And, by the end of the lesson, she was already on her way to being able to do this on her own. And, we went and played a couple of games, and, her AD carry gameplay had been vastly improved, even just from me giving her the framework and then asking her questions about, like, how, what does it mean in this situation?
Sure.
And so, like, and that's a lot different than what I think a lot of coaches do. They'll, it's not knowledge telling, but it's give the framework and then let them sort of, like, work through the problems themselves with your guidance, I think is a really, what I'm finding to be a really strong way to teach League really quickly. Yeah.
And that's kind of a general rule of teaching in general, is what you'll find. The idea of, there are kind of two different ways to check for understanding. One is to ask, and the enormous issue with asking is that what you're going to get is not whether or not they understand. What you're going to get is whether or not they think they understand. Right?
Exactly.
Whereas if you instead ask them to show what they know, if you have them run through exercises, if you have them actually try to do the thing, and that's a much better check for understanding, because you can actually see what it is that they don't see in terms of the flaws in what's been communicated. So definitely I think that's a really good approach to take.
it definitely improved her understanding a lot faster, I think, than most coaches would get, because I've done both styles of coaching, where I just kind of do telling and then do like a live session and then kind of like correct them on the way. But I found a replay in which I give them the feedback, the mental model, and then give them feedback along the way as we're going through the replay was a lot more beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's almost certainly going to be a pattern that continues. Another quote, what sets expert performers apart from everyone else is the quality and quantity of their mental representations. Through years of practice, they develop highly complex and sophisticated representations of the various situations they are likely to encounter in their fields. These representations allow them to make faster, more accurate decisions and respond more quickly and effectively in a given situation. Right? Does a pretty good job of kind of displaying what some of the benefits of creating good mental representations are. Right? You are faster, you make better decisions, you respond more quickly, and generally are more effective. Right? The other thing that he goes on to say is that mental representations also enable learning. Right? In music, mental representations of how the piece is supposed to sound allow a musician to provide their own feedback and practice purposefully on their own. Novice musicians have a less detailed ear and rely more on teachers to provide feedback on mistakes that they themselves can't actually detect, right? Mm-hmm. And in particular, one set of mental representations allows a student to prescribe for themselves practice that is appropriate to the type of mistake that they're making. Mental representations of the learning process enable learning to occur more effectively, right? The more that you learn about how learning works, the more that you'll be able to see when maybe the problem isn't with the change that you're trying to make, but rather with the way that you're trying to make it, or something like that, right?
Indeed, that makes sense to me. And that's sort of like what Jared Tendler says, too.
Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much everything that I had for this particular chapter. Was there anything that you felt like I missed? Or
no, not at all, for sure. I thought that was a really good one to go over. And sort of like the biggest points I took away were from the idea of maybe spending more time reviewing and learning outside to basically burn those mental models that you create cognitively into your subconscious, so that way you don't have to spend as much time practicing them in game to be able to do them. And I've certainly noticed this in my own gameplay, where I spent a lot of time just thinking about matchups and the four little things and the box positioning between the parallel positioning and stuff, and I'm starting to be able to do it automatically, having practiced it very little actually.
Well, that's what I would say is that you've practiced it very little in game, but you've actually practiced it quite a bit. You've gotten a lot of reps in of doing it, and the way that you were able to do that is by basically doing mental rehearsals outside of the actual play session, right? You're looking at VODs, you're looking at pro play games, you're even just thinking about it and visualizing the game on your own with nothing to guide you on it, and these sorts of exercises are practice, right? They're practice in applying the mental models that you're doing. The reason that play tends to be really important is because it's kind of a grounding factor, right? If you practice using mental representations a whole bunch, but then you go into game and you apply your mental model, and what happens is completely different than what you expected, then now you're in kind of a bind, right? Now you've spent all this time kind of practicing something that doesn't actually work, right? Mm-hmm. So the game is a really important tool in that it grounds what's true, right? The game is the ultimate source of truth. But if you're already fairly confident that the change is one that's grounded in reality and that will actually be good, for instance, you maybe learned it from watching a pro player, or the coach has already kind of verified that it's something that's like, good, then you can get plenty of practice outside of the game just by doing reviews and decision-making exercises, and that will actually transfer into the game because the chunks are essentially being solidified, right? You're creating the mental model simply by thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. And that's sort of on top of that, like, so much less of your mental effort it has to be, devoted to actually playing. That, like, when you're doing it in review, you can spend so much more time thinking about it, doing those miniature reps. But you end up getting much more value out of the reps anyway, because it's like, when you're playing a game, you don't have time to think about whether or not you were right and wrong until after the game anyway.
It's a really great isolation room, right? If we're thinking about the triple I method and Matt Thornton and all that, it's like they're able to slow the game down because they actually, it's a 1v1 game, and you cooperate with your opponent to make something happen, right? But in League, even if you're cooperating with the other player, the game doesn't pause unless you actually use the pause feature, right? So minion waves will continue to spawn, jungle timers will continue to go, right? You can't actually do the same kind of slow motion stuff that you can in physical sports, right? So instead, using slow motion and looking and going through VODs is probably about the best substitute that we have.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine. So,
and I would tend to agree with that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well,
but you have dinner soon, right?
I do indeed. So we'll go ahead and call it here.
Okay, man. Well, it was fun. We'll see you next week. We're doing another next week we're doing another chapter, or?
Yep. As far as I'm aware. So, see you next week.
See ya.
Bye-bye.